thanks a lot for inviting me to speak or to talk in your nice COCO research lab. I feel very honored. Yes, as you can see, the title is Do You See Us? As some of you requested, it refers to an article I just wrote together with two colleagues on methods. Not exactly about video analysis, but I'm about to write a book chapter together with Ricky Goldman on this topic, so I'm just up to have a look back and a small preview. Do you see us? You might wonder who is you and who is us. And the answer is you is them and us is us is them and you is us. And this change of perspectives should also symbolize what's the unit of analysis in CSCL research, which is the groups and group processes. And researchers, as you might know or might not know, are kind of struggling with going deeply into the group's processes and really detect moments of learning in qualitative research, or also to detect larger amounts of learning and learning successes in more quantitative approaches. So that's quite on purpose that this change of perspectives was done, also in the article's title. And this talk today will be divided into two parts. The first part is about state of the art and some future perspectives in video data collection, transformation, coding, and analyses. I will just talk a little bit about the benefits and challenges. I will skip the historical part. You can read it in the books of Ricky and articles of Ricky Goldman and Sharon Derry, but it's I think it would take too long. It would be boring. It went back 200 years ago. Okay, so I'll skip that and give some examples of current state of the art in video methods. It's not that there are so many methods articles out there, so I had to kind of pick up these examples from existing works where the focus was not on methodology, but on the contents they were investigating. All right. To begin with, what do we analyze? Just to make things clear again, we analyze computer-supported collaborative learning. That means that computer support is the use of digital media and tools, and we analyze, therefore, human-computer interaction of one or more humans interacting with one or different tools. Collaboration is social interactions, be it in person, face-to-face, or online, when humans interact with each other. And learning is bound to a specific setting, specific task, learning goals, and mostly very targeted activities to support learning, and of course the outcomes, what makes learning effective. And it's the learning of co-located or virtual groups. So that's just at least my understanding of what we are talking about to analyze here. Can you see the screen? Because And just to go back, we also study, of course, the interrelation of using tools in social interactions and in a specific setting with specific tasks and goals and so forth. So this is kind of a complex issue, as we can also see in this general model of activity systems by Grino and Engeström from 2014, which is more of a networked idea of collaborative learning, placing the subject into the center, and there's an arrow missing to the learning object, and the instruments and tools, rules, community, and division of work, and the outcomes and success. All interconnected, and all these arrows are processes, like subjects are using instruments and digital tools for learning, and the community uses instruments and tools for learning, and the object, the learning topic, for example, makes specific instruments necessary so that we can understand it, and so forth. If there are any questions, don't hesitate. A much more simple model is the model of Edinger and Reimer, which comes originally from the libraries, learning in libraries idea, and they talk about knowledge spaces, which I think are very important also for computer-supported collaborative learning. And they're not, at least in the research I know, they're not always represented in equal amount of research articles. I think there's the knowledge spaces are, just to describe them, are called the digital space, which we know quite well in CSCL, and the social space, which we also know quite well, and then the physical space, which is sometimes a little bit neglected in CSCL research. And more than that, in especially video-based research, we sometimes restrict our learners in the physical space, in their possibilities to move in physical space because of our methods, which is kind of a problem. I did that in my own experience, so I know what I'm talking about. I forced students to sit in front of a computer and stay there because I wanted to video record their learning and their interactions. Okay, so this model is very simple, of course, and it's not meant as a model for understanding CSCL, but it's meant to as a structure for orientation, to talk about what we are analyzing in video research. And also talk about the benefits and challenges that go along with it. So, in the digital space, we often work with screen recordings of tool-related activities. I will give examples just in a minute. In social space, we often do audio-visual recordings of communication, having audio and having video, but we want to record or capture the communication process. And then in the physical space, we have video recordings of movements and activities. And what video does is it affords observations of how learning unfolds over time. So we can follow from the beginning to the end of a lesson, for example, what happens and how things change. It's observing. And it also affords observation of how learning occurs in the knowledge spaces that I just showed you in this structure. Now, to give you some examples to make things more tangible, I have collected 4 studies that illustrate the use of video recordings and analyses in these different spaces. Of course, there are overlaps, as you can see, and these are important overlaps, and all those studies I will report to you now are in those overlapping zones between the digital space and the social space, for example, or the physical space and the digital space, and so forth. So the first study I would like to tell you about is the Vogler et al. 2017. That was a study with graduate students in education in the US, and the topic was writing in online environments. And what Vogler et al. Did, they wanted to answer the research question on how single utterances in groups influence a group's understanding in online discussions. So they wanted to see the biography of an utterance that starts in one point of the discussion and then gets comments and answers and then evolves. And they were interested in how groups develop an understanding of the topic at hand by following the biography of such an utterance, the history. They call it biography. And they had a setting in a classroom where they had students sit on computers and using a chat tool for verbal online discussions. And what they did, they screen recorded all the activities of the students, writing, editing, deleting, whatever, and they videotaped them as well, and they also conducted interviews with selected students to make sure that they understood things the way they were experienced by the students. And then they chose from their video materials, at least for this article that appeared in the International Journal of Computer Supported Collaborative Learning, they chose one case and did a qualitative analysis, not on one case in terms of a group, but one case of utterance history that led to a discussion and finally ended up in developing the understanding in the group. So this was a very deep and very close transcript-based qualitative analysis they were proposing. And so they gave a lot of descriptive details on how online discussions are influenced by single comments. This was more on the digital space because it was an online discussion, but it was also in the social space because it was a discussion. The second example I would like to give you is an example of my own research at Knowledge Media Research Center a couple of years ago, where we investigated in a classroom-like research space students, 7th graders, performing a design task. They used a video web tool called WebDiver, and their task was in a history lesson to construct a web page for a virtual history museum on the internet. And thereby, it was supposed that they would learn the contents, of course. And they did so in groups. We had 148 students participating. They came by bus in our lab. It's kind of funny. We had those classes in there. And we video recorded their group collaborations. Our research question was whether social or cognitive guidance of student teams would result in better learning outcomes and more efficient or effective group processes. Social guidance was realized by means of just raising the awareness of the students of how they want to work together in their group, what social rules they would like to apply in their own groups, like letting each other talk until the end and not interrupting each other. So they established those rules for 2 minutes in the beginning of the session, and in the other condition, in the control condition, they didn't. They had a task, cognitive instruction, where they were told over and over again what the task was about and what they had to do first and second and third and so on. Okay, so we did screen recordings of what the students did with the video web tool, with the film they were working on. They were working on historical newsreel. And we also had webcam recordings. We had the students sitting in front of the computer and the webcam that recorded. It was diodes, it was no real proofs, it was diodes. And we recorded them. And we had audio recordings. And that's what I meant before when I said we forced them to sit there, because usually they would maybe wander around in the room, in the classroom, and do things and talk to other groups, but they couldn't. We just restricted them in our lab situation. I'm doing a study right now with the topic of natural science in a similar way. But in this study we found out that, oh no, I have to tell you that we coded and counted in this case. So we had the video recordings, the screen recordings, and we categorized what we saw in the video according to what the students were talking about, verbal communication. And then we counted the time, how long they talked about, for instance, content, or about their task, or whatever, or off task. And we counted the time, and then we calculated the relative time of talking in these categories, and then we did our quantitative analysis with the data. So this was kind of not a qualitative in-depth, but a quantitative, experimental kind of investigation. And we found out that the social guidance really helps students to learn better, significantly better, which was kind of a nice result to have, because we only invested 3 minutes in the beginning of the lesson, so to make them aware of how they want to cooperate and collaborate socially. Okay, so this research example belongs to the intersection between social and virtual digital space.
Sorry, question. So for your study, I know you told the students to stay in front of the computer. Would it be feasible in the future to have a bigger camera, or a camera that captures the whole room, to better reflect the real classroom?
I want to come to this right away, because there are people who use other cameras.
Oh, yes.
Yes. To answer this, it would be, for example, 360-degree camera, or positioning like 8 or 10 cameras. As you will see, there are options to cover a whole soccer field, so it shouldn't be such a problem with the cameras. Yes. Third study I would like to tell you about is by Meikki and others, which was conducted in Finland with students in teacher education. And their task was to design, that's a kind of complicated. The topic was environmental science, like about the climate or species or topics like that. And their task as student teachers was to design a lesson for primary school students, so that they would learn how to design a lesson, but also to learn the content. And that's the Finnish concept of teacher education, learning contents together with pedagogy. This was also a design task, so to speak, and it was a 6-week environmental science course at this Finnish university. And they took out lessons from this 6-week course, and 5 students who were working, 5 groups of students who were working on these lesson planning tasks. And they did so 5 times. 5 times they followed the same groups. In the end, they had 20 hours of video materials. From a 360-degree camera, they placed right into the classroom space. So they had the round view and had all groups they wanted to follow on their videos. And the coding occurred in a multi-step analysis. They coded the video data on a time base. They made 30-second segments, and then they looked in each segment in the first step what was happening there in a rough way, just to reduce their materials. In the second step, then they looked at specific events that were important for their research question. And their research question was whether or not group regulation scripts, socio-cognitive or socio-emotional scripts, would increase learning and success in group work. And again, it was similar to the other study I told you about. It was cognitive in the one condition. They had cognitive, no, not in one condition, but they had both in all groups. So they had cognitive scripts that helped them with the task, and they had socio-emotional scripts which helped them in the group in the social collaboration situation, social interaction and behaviors. And in the second step, when they were done with the rough coding, they did a more fine-grained coding on whether or not monitoring in the group occurred, whether they self-regulated, self-monitored, and whether they changed things in their behaviors. And they found as well positive effects of socio-emotional scripts. All right. So this was, in this area, they covered more of the physical space of learning, and the digital space was rather limited, but the social space was, sorry, this arrow is wrong, it should go here. Sorry. Moved. Last but not least, the fourth example I would like to give you is a study of Scienc et al. From 2015, which was about investigating collaborative group engagement. And the authors divided collaborative group engagement into 4 dimensions, including behavioral engagement, which is simply on or off task behavior, social engagement, which is about how the group works together, how people respect the others and talk to each other. Then there is cognitive engagement, which is also related to the task completion, and conceptual to consequential engagement, which means that when students produce something, a product, how well can they put their understanding of a topic into a product, like into a presentation or into a model or whatever. And the authors had 7th graders in the US study aquatic ecosystems. In the lesson they videotaped was a pond lesson. It was inquiry learning about the possible causes of fish death. But that was just an example. They wanted to know whether this collaborative group engagement would support learning. And the task was to design a model with the software the students received. The task had 3 phases, like they created initial models, the students then they get feedback from the teacher and the other students, and then they revised their model and created a final version of it. And these authors wanted to investigate the quality of high versus low collaborative engagement, And therefore they videotaped students working on their tasks, and they developed an observation tool to code collaborative group engagement on the 4 dimensions in high or low quality. And what they did, why I found this very interesting, was they coded, they segmented the videos they had of 10 groups, by the way, 36 students. They segmented it into 5-minute intervals, and they observed the fluctuations of collaborative group engagement quality throughout the lessons. So they wouldn't think that decreasing engagement is a catastrophe or so, but it depends on how it fluctuates and how the group is able to regulate after maybe a decrease in collaborative group engagement. And what is interesting about this study is that they created graphs to follow this fluctuation, and they interpreted these graphs, and they also selected cases of high versus low quality and did close transcript-related detailed qualitative analysis in addition. So just to show you what they ended up with was they had like group 6 behavioral engagement, and then they had 5-minute segments, and you can see how the quality of the group engagement fluctuates over time. And that's the same for social engagement in that same group, and that for cognitive engagement and for conceptual to consequential engagement. So this is a kind of a visual approach to what happened in the groups when they developed their collaboration over time. What they found was close interrelations between the different types of engagement, and also, quite interestingly, they could, in a qualitative analysis, they could show how misunderstandings and problems with cognitive engagement, that means task-related misunderstandings, for example, or not enough engagement in the task, finally ended up in social drops in social engagement, so that the group wouldn't, like each other anymore. They withdraw in the group socially. In these groups, it was just a single case, but it was kind of interesting. This article is interesting to read, how they could show the interdependence of task-related engagement to finally social engagement. Okay, so that's the examples I would like to give you. Let me just go ahead to some of the challenges you might have also realized during the different examples. What is really important in video collection and analysis, and a big challenge, is that we always keep the awareness of the complexity of the materials and the highly selective nature of what we're doing when we work on those materials, starting from positioning the cameras. We make a decision to look upon people or to look up on them with our cameras, and we also make decisions to what frame we will really capture. So never lose sight of this, which is hard, I think, when we're into the data, to lose sight of that it's highly selective and there may be other things going on which we just didn't capture. Another challenge is that we, like Dariet emphasized, need an analytical framework. Always question, what am I observing, how, and why? Especially why. Because with 50 or 30 or 70 hours of video, you might lose the feeling of what you're observing and why. Then there is a certain arbitrariness of behavior categories. As you have seen from the examples, we have completely different behaviors in the groups, although they are similar, but the categories just are dependent on the researchers who formulate them. Based on theory or less based on theory, but it's kind of, it can be arbitrary. And then what Blickstadt and Ballas emphasize is that contextualization is very important. So we should always stay close enough to the situation so we can observe things actually. But then we should always keep an eye on context, the wider context, the room where it takes place, the physical space, and the digital space, the network, whatever. And then adherence to relevance. Also, Blickstadt and Ballas say that it's important that relevance is not only from the perspective of the researchers, but it's from the perspective of the learners. We might, as researchers, magnify events of learning which we think are important and make significant results and whatever, but they may not be the most important thing for the learners. And then finally, adequate representations are important. We mostly translate our video data into some categories, abstract numbers, whatever, and on conferences we present results based on these abstractions from the original data. And we have also kind of problems with data and rights protection, so we cannot go to conferences and just show our videos, but then we should find ways to communicate our interpretations on a basis that makes other researchers, it helps other researchers to interpret their own, make their own conclusions and see whether our interpretations are plausible or not. So that's the challenges, some of the challenges. And not as a prescription, but as an orientation of what we could do about this situation is just to apply a kind of a process chart, how we want to proceed, and look at it from time to time and just stating where we are, seeing, locate ourselves as researchers, where are we and what did we want to do. It starts with the research questions, of course, and then the definition of the group setting to be observed, decisions on scene selections, define the relevant behaviors to be captured, because, as I said, relevance is not easy to define. It might be our relevance, but it might be the learner's relevance. So it might be a prior study which is necessary, or interviews to define those relevant behaviors. Then data collection, of course, video, audio, log files, movement tracking, whatever. I will go into more advanced methods in the second part. And then we develop, once we got the data, we develop the behavior categories. If we have a theory, we can do it deductively, or also in other steps, in emergent categories. Or we do we do qualitative analyses and detailed data interpretation. Then we get standalone results, but we could also fed them into mixed method approaches and so forth. We could also count behavior occurrences and quantify frequencies, etc., and then do statistical analysis for hypothesis testing and standalone results or interim results that go into other comparisons and calculations. So that's just for orientation, a suggestion which might make sense to keep, how do you say, ein Überblick behalten.
See the forest in all the trees.
You're right. Now some future perspectives for video collection and analysis. There was suggested to use VR methods to for CSCL research, because when you use VR devices, it affords the collection of tracking data in most cases. I've got a colleague in my university in Switzerland who is specialized on data science, and he collects data via VR glasses and headsets. And also head tracking is a possibility, which might be very interesting, detecting nonverbal behaviors by head positions and tracking them, of course, because to be able to handle the data later on. VR also affords research in entirely new CSCL scenarios, of course, because we can investigate behaviors, collaborative learning in VR scenarios. Then observations of learning in extended physical spaces, like augmented reality spaces, or in simulations. And observations of interactions in adaptive environments or with other humans that are represented, for example, by avatars. Yeah, we have different scenarios. We could also compare, like interaction with remote people or interaction with via our avatars or with avatars. There's a lot of different opportunities, which are not that I know of, which are not realized so far, or only partly. One example of that was not meant as a methodological study, but it was about content, was by Katrin Almendinger, a former colleague of mine. She studied the effects of nonverbal communication of avatars in problem solving, and she varied avatars who were nodding their heads and being polite or not giving such feedback, and she found that people found the communication much smoother and were more interested in the topic and more motivated, of course, when the avatars were friendly avatars, nodding their heads, giving feedback. Okay, so just to go into the details of visual analysis real quick. What can visual analysis add to common methods? Common methods are those I just told you about. And visual analysis wants to tackle some of the common problems with common methods. One I just told you about is the controlled lab or field settings, where physical space is always limited due to our recordings, and we thus investigate only highly task-specific and limited ecologically valid situations. We have also rich data on computer and social interactions and communication data, and hours of video materials. We all know the problem. Extensive log files, and all this is time dependent and fluctuations and so forth, so it's a lot of work to do. And all this is on individual, small group or class levels. We have multi-level tasks in a methodological sense to accomplish. And then we have fluid processes. I showed in the other example that group processes should be studied dynamically, spatially, and temporally, because a drop in one category, for example, might be regulated by a group, and this might be interesting as a process. So, as many CSCL youth researchers emphasize, new methods are wanted, and especially automated tracking methods and methods that help us to visualize behaviors and behavior patterns better. Also, nonverbal behavior in the physical and social spaces and their interactions are an important topic of research, which just needs more support by the methods we have now. And visual analysis could help this. Visual analysis is the concept of augmenting human cognitive reasoning abilities through specifically designed representations, visualizations, coupling them with underlying algorithmic analytical processes and enhancing the resulting displays by effective interaction metaphors. So researchers can be supported in hypothesis testing, for example, generation, for example, because they get a visual impression of the data they have in front of them, even if it's large data. And an example from soccer, where this, it probably from the TV, is done on a regular basis.
You don't watch soccer this time.
You don't? Well, anyway, in Germany, we watch soccer. And we see this on a regular basis. The principle is that you have video recordings of, like in this case, it's implicit team coordination in a soccer team, and you have tracking data like trajectories or whatever, and then you can project the results of the tracking data back into the video. And here you can see, for example, this would be somebody who ran a lot, and this would be somebody from the other team who didn't run so very much. And you could do this on any kind of data and behavior category, which would be interesting if you think about real field learning settings. This was described by Stein et al. Then there is an example from social science research from my colleague Susanne Bleich, which is also in the other article. She did a study on how elderly people remember their own city, and they walked through the city of Olten, which is the town where I work, with the elderly, and they conducted interviews with them. On different topics, like where they have contact with other people, or where they feel safe and where they feel unsafe, and so forth. And then they had these data and visualized them in these ways. So we have a ground map of Olten, and we have now the places where people have a lot of contact or not so much contact, and where they feel safe, for example, and where they not feel so safe. I think I'll run out of time, so I'll just skip this example or make it very short. It's about collaboration at interactive tabletops, multi-touch tabletops, an example of our own research in Olten, where we investigated territorial behaviors of people collaborating, collaboratively solving problems at multi-touch tabletops. And we gave them little private territories in the form of iPads, or we didn't give them these territories, and looked at what they did and how well they were able to solve their problems, which was a design problem and a brainstorming task. And we found that these private territories were very important for the brainstorming task, but not at all important for the design task in architectural design. So it depends on tasks whether or not territories are important. In terms of methods, we produce density maps depicting the behaviors at the tabletop, and these dark zones are the zones where they were very active, and the lighter the zone, the less they were touching the table. But as I said, I won't have time to do this in detail, because I want to tell you this about informal learning, the work of Ben Shapiro, who studied informal learning in a museum gallery. It was a gallery on Hank Smith, country musician, and he investigated how learning occurred in this environment. learning of a family. It was just one case study. And he had family members, Lily, Jeans, Adhere, Blake, who, of different ages, and Mom, who doesn't have a name, but she was there as well. And what he did was he had a floor plan of the museum gallery, and he tracked the waves the people made through the gallery. And for example, this blue line is Blake, 6 years old, who was running back and forth between different family members and the exhibits, and he was very lively, obviously. And these other lines represent the other persons, and they were just overlaid. So we can see now that Adhere, for example, was Blake met Adhere at this point, for example. And then Shapiro showed these visualizations to museum curators, and what he found, did a focus group, and what he found was that they completely changed their views on learning, because before they had the impression that running back and forth between exhibits and people was no way of good learning. And then after that and some qualitative analyses, they changed their minds and they changed their professional vision on this. So that's also a very interesting work to read. In sum, what could visual analysis add to the process I just showed to you? It could include algorithmic analysis of movement trackings or other captured data with video recordings, and it would also give us the possibility to design visualizations to overlay or concurrently analyze different types of data and synchronize them, for example, data from different persons, and get a visual impression which is different from abstract cognitive processing of abstract information. Yes. It's also a better method to handle large and unstructured data in general, because we can just, comprise them and project them onto videos, like I showed you with the supper example. So that's it. A little bit too long, and thanks for your attention.